So, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the new Economic Forum on Digitalization and the New Gilded Age. Some of you might remember Mark Twain. He's the one who coined the term the Gilded Age to describe a period of powerful monopolies, opulence, and, as you saw on the screen, inequality. He was referring to the late 19th century, when a handful of railroad giants in the United States controlled the movement of goods and people, building enormous fortunes in the process. There were a few similar events in the course of later decades, but if we fast forward to 2018, a number of internet giants control much of the global movement of data and information. And the founders of these companies count amongst the richest persons in the world. So, does history repeat itself? We're going to discuss the role of these big tech titans and explore whether we might be yet in another Gilded Age. And if so, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And if the latest headlines are any indication, are we headed towards a new era of regulation, and if so, which one and how broad? We heard in the past about the effort to bust the trusts. Would the trusts be in the way of trust? Now, will there be a similar call today? Burst the trusts in the name of trust. Let us also consider the questions that go beyond the monopoly power issue. Earlier this year, Bill Gates waded in on the topic. He said, I quote, "Invisible financial transactions and the lack of government access to criminal communications are areas that are ripe for regulation." Recent revelations related to Cambridge Analytica shed light on the depth and breadth of data being shared and possibly co-opted without our knowledge. And I'm not sure that the latest hearings before Senate and House committees actually shed a lot of light on these questions. So we have plenty to discuss. Let me introduce our panel. To my left, if I may call him, as my friend, Tharman, Singapore Deputy Prime Minister and Coordinating Minister for Economic and Social Policies, currently also chair of the Group of 30. He's a very close friend of the IMF, having led the International Monetary and Financial Committee from 2011 to 2014. He also happened to have been the Minister of Finance for a period of his life and the Minister of Education for another period of his life. Bridget von Kronlingen is Senior Vice President for IBM. She leads IBM's global business and technology capabilities, helping global industry clients to adopt new business models using cloud platforms with artificial intelligence and blockchain. Thank you for being with us again, Bridget. Alec Ross is a New York Times best-selling author and technology policy expert. His book, titled The Industries of the Future, lays out a series of new ideas for ways that everyday workers can seize new economic opportunities. He started his life as a teacher in Baltimore City public schools before co-founding a non-profit organization focused on bridging the digital divide. And Richard White, professor of American history at Stanford University, his most recent book is on the United States during Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. He specializes in the American West, history of capitalism, environmental and Native American history. Richard, I'm going to, if I may call you Richard and not Professor, as I would otherwise respectfully do, but you allow me to call you Richard. Could you give us a brief sketch of the Gilded Age and its similarities with the period that we are in now?
Okay. In giving you a description of the Gilded Age, the similarities are going to be readily apparent, so I won't draw them out as extensively as I might. The Gilded Age, the name comes from, as we've seen, Mark Twain, and what it indicates is a period of surface prosperity and beneath it an underlying, as Americans considered at the time, rot. It's a period of tremendous corruption. It's a period of financial corruption. It's a period of political corruption. And it's widely recognized through American society. It is also going to be a period of tremendous economic growth. This is the period in which the United States becomes a world economic power. The American GNP, though these numbers seem small, they were tremendous at the time, rises from $1.1 billion in 1869 to $13.7 billion by 1896. And at that time, the United States is the leading industrial power in the world, and it's also the leading agricultural producer. The major change in the period, as far as most Americans were concerned, is one we don't think about as much today, and that during this period, people go from being self-employed to being wage laborers. Before this, wage labor was a stage in life. By the 1870s, wage labor is a permanent condition, and many of the economic struggles over the period are that people feel they're losing control over their work, which they see as a danger in a democracy. For all the tremendous economic growth, it's going to be a period of great inequality. And the inequality is most easily measured not by economic statistics, but by some basic demographic measures. We would expect, with production going up so rapidly, with wealth rising, that people would be better off. But by every demographic measure we have, they are worse off. Their lifespans shorten, they grow shorter, infant death rates rise, and it's only going to be in the 1890s that many of these things turn around. The kinds of basic changes in health, welfare, longevity are 20th century phenomena. They're not 19th century phenomena. Still, people come to the United States. The United States has a competitive advantage over other economies at the time, and the United States becomes an immigrant nation in the late 19th century. By 1890, nearly 15% of the American population had been born in another country, and that is still the highest figure in American history. There's going to be a nativist reaction to this. And by the 1880s, 1890s, there's strong calls for immigration restriction. It's going to be a very, very competitive economy, but the competitive economy itself is going to contribute to the growth of monopolies. The idea that competition is ruinous and that over and over again trusts, pools, and by the end of the period, corporations are rising to make the units of production larger and larger. The politics at the time are bitter. By the 1880s, 1890s, barely a year goes by without troops being committed to American streets to put down strikes. There is bitter fighting, which goes from urban areas all across the United States. At the end, it is going to be a period by 1896, which is summed up by Henry George's bestseller of 20 years earlier, in which he said the question of the United States is progress and poverty. How can increasing poverty exist in the midst of such economic progress? And I'll stop here by simply pointing out in 1896, which is at one point where the Gilded Age might end, there are both going to be great utopian fictions, Bellamy's Looking Backward, and dystopian fictions. And this sort of describes the idea of the American public. they cannot tell whether all of this 40 years of change has brought out a dystopian future or a utopian future. And one of the aspects of this that's most interesting is I'm coming from Los Angeles. One of the buildings in Los Angeles, the Bradbury Building, is built to show Bellamy's utopian future. It also becomes the set of the great dystopian film of the late 19th century, Blade Runner. Both of them go back and forth at the same time.
Wow. Thank you very much, Richard. We just heard about workers not feeling in control of their destiny. Now, take us into what you focus on, what you like, which is the future.
Yes.
What do you think, what impact do all these new changes, technologies and otherwise, have on workers?
Yeah, so look, the future is not utopian. This isn't Star Trek. We aren't all going to grow up to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, lacking for nothing. But it's also not Mad Max. We aren't all doomed. And I think that a lot of there's sort of this false binary a lot of the time when people talk about technology and what this means for future workers, whether it's either utopian or dystopian. And I think that if you do look at what is to come, I think what we will continue to see is increased bounty, but also increased spread. So what this technology does is it enables people across demographics, across income strata, to benefit from more. And more defined as more information, longer lives. You know, as we get into the commercialization of genomics made possible by the digitization of the life sciences, we can expect that life expectancy will continue to increase. But the downside of all of this are two things. Number one, the business models are largely winner takes all. And so we see a very small number of individuals and firms overwhelmingly accruing the economic benefit of people imagining and inventing the future. And then the difference between the industrial age, as described by Richard, is as innovation took place at that time, it created these massive middle classes, these massive middle class workforces, whereas in the industries of the future, you can create companies with tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap, but with a shockingly small workforce. And so in this world, when you think about, too, the rise of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, what we will increasingly see is labor substitution that isn't just the work of men with strong shoulders doing work that is manual and routine, but also increasingly cognitive and non-routine. And so what we're going to see is what seems to be contradictory. Higher standards of living, longer lives, access to more information, access to more entertainment, the ability to do more with less, while simultaneous to that, life almost grows more difficult economically, at least in the more highly developed parts of the world. In the developing parts of the world, I actually think that these very powerful tools and these very powerful platforms enable individuals and institutions to compete in ways that weren't previously possible during the industrial age, where, you know, for example, when the railroads came out, there were massive differences between the deployment of rail infrastructure in the developed world versus the developing world. Because digitization, while it's not happening uniformly, it is largely happening globally. I think we can see advancement rates that are more uniform than what we saw during the industrial age.
Okay, you did exactly what I was hoping, which is take us into the future and through what we're possibly living now, which could be a transition period, which might look like a little bit of what Richard was describing. You know, you say longer life. There are arguments today that some people have a shorter life than a longer life, or that what we were expecting.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, it's a relatively small number of people who have shorter lives, who are living shorter lives, or who are living, frankly, worse lives. It tends to be low-skilled or somewhat skilled workers in developed economies, largely in Western European and in North American economies, whereas the rest of the world, what we continue to see is, I think, a pretty good upward slope in well-being measured, whether it's life expectancy, household income, or other measures.
Correct. Bridget, From your vantage point, and part of your job, in addition to leading this team of fantastic researchers, is to convince some of your clients of the value of innovations, the value of these new technologies. Do you think that in that process, do you yourself witness an erosion of trust and an element of insecurity about this future?
So, thank you, Christine, and let me bridge the past, the future, with a little bit about what I see now in the impact of technology. And you are right that data is both the phenomenon of our time, but also the issue of our time. And recently we've looked at data being used and exploited in ways that nobody can feel good about and should not happen. But in fact, that's just one piece of the technology. These technologies that are around today, artificial intelligence, blockchain, can be used for the good of humans and for productivity. And I think on the trust point, Christine, one of the things to think about rather than trust busting is trust building. So with artificial intelligence, what are the models and the way that data is protected and secured in anyone's business model is a very important consideration. Commitments for privacy and exchange and transparency in return for personalization and customization, I think, are pervading many business models where commitments are made to protect data. And then there are promising new technologies such as blockchain that really can make a difference to trust in the world. And whilst a lot of the time we think about blockchain as cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, at its root, the technology of blockchain is a distributed ledger that can actually share and store permissioned data and permissioned transactions or interactions in a way which is accountable, transparent, and immutable, so nobody can take it or change it or steal it from you. And that technology, I believe, has the potential to build more openness, more trust, and more transparency, and in fact change from winner-takes-all networks to networks where everybody chooses and gains with accountability and transparency.
Bridget, do you mind telling us just a few words about the extraordinary work that you're doing in Kenya, which contributes to building trust and helping people develop their business that they would not otherwise develop?
Yes, so whilst blockchain can be used by many big corporations and big businesses to change supply chains, it's also incredibly empowering for small businesses and small networks. And we announced today about some work we're doing in Kenya with Twiga, which is a microfinance organization. And what they're able to do is do the algorithms for credit, extension of credit, based on seeing people's behavior on a blockchain and how they manage their cash and how they trade. So the credit scoring is far more behaviorally based on behavior on a blockchain. Loans are issued instantaneously to the traders and the retailers. And within the pilot period, which ran for three or 4 months, we were able to take 200 microfinance small business customers, increase their volumes by 30% and their profits by 6% by timeous and relevant credit scoring on a blockchain. So that's an example where everyone in that system won because of a blockchain.
And integrity of the system as a result of use of blockchain.
And everyone trusted the system because it can't be changed.
Yeah.
Consensus driven.
Tarman, you've been giving a lot of thoughts to all these issues. Singapore as well, and Singapore is leading in that field in many respects, including in finance. What lessons can we learn? What thoughts do you have? Because I can't resist asking you that question. And do you believe, as a policymaker, and having thought a lot about it, do you believe that regulations going forward is inevitable, and how so?
So to answer your last question first, I think it is inevitable, but we've got to be very careful about the purpose of regulation. The reason why regulation has to increase is because we've got to help markets work better. So it's not so much about constraining markets, but markets aren't working very well. And the reason, it seems a little paradoxical, but the reason why we need more and better regulation is we've got to help markets work better to spread innovation and to help people to be better matched to new jobs, which require new skills, and which can ultimately give them better pay. I have a slightly different take on the way things are going compared to what was said so far. Our central problem isn't just inequality. The first problem we face is that the bounty isn't going up. The bounty isn't going up. Increasing concentration and winner takes all has not been matched by an increase in the bounty at a faster rate than it has been historically. In fact, there's been a slowdown in productivity growth, no matter how you measure it. And for all the arguments about the statistics, it's a fact. The raw fact of the matter is that innovation has slowed. It's very vibrant amongst a very small group of companies near the frontiers of technology. It's vibrant in the software space, but by and large, we're not seeing very much innovation across the wide span of our economies. And that's why median incomes have stagnated. That's why, by and large, small companies are stagnating. And that's why there's a mood of despondency. So the issues to do with inequality are central in our minds, both social policy-wise and economic policy-wise. But the first order of business has to be to spur innovation, find ways in which what happens at the frontier spreads more quickly to the rest of society and to other firms. And it's not happening through market mechanisms. We've got to find ways in which the implicit barriers that are being set up by the winners in the corporate sector can be broken down through regulation, so that you don't just have a Darwinian process of winners takes all, but you have more of a Schumpeterian process of new players coming in, startups becoming medium size and becoming large size. You need more churn in industry.
Do you foresee a breakup of the tech titans at some stage to precisely address this point that you're making?
So
we've seen it in other industries in the past.
You've seen it, and that's what happened to AT&T. That's what happened. That was the traditional model. This time round, we know things aren't working well, and we do not yet have the answers.
Right.
We do not yet have the answers because we are no longer in a situation where monopoly power has led to consumers paying more. In fact, typically they're paying less. The new question that's on our minds now is that consumers are effectively paying through data.
Yeah.
They're not paying through higher prices for the software or the game or the app.
And it's inadvertent.
It's largely inadvertent, and we're all guilty of having ticked the box without realizing what we're giving away. Yeah. And that's a new regulatory issue for public policy. I don't think breaking things up per se helps, because it can hurt the consumer if you don't have the network size and you don't have the economies of scale. So it's a whole new set of issues. We have some ideas in our minds as policymakers, but I don't think we should rush to a quick solution.
Yeah, because the credit record that you were talking about, if there was some sort of breakup, not that your company would be a target of that breaking up, but you would lose some of it, presumably, or some part of the business would lose access to that. So before I turn back to you, Richard, because we are using lots of tools, we've been doing a little bit of survey of our IMF fans to ask them, and the question was, they were expected to respond by Twitter. And the question was, do we need to regulate big tech firms to prevent monopolies? So I'll share the results with you. 36% said regulate sparingly. 34% said we need a big overhaul. 19% said no, let markets work. And 11% said not yet, too much unknown. Well, we know where some stand. So Richard, moving on from the Gilded Age to progressive era, which is the time, if I recall, where the trusts were bust. Has that resulted in success, the fact that monopolies didn't exist anymore? And how did the US exit the Gilded Age?
Okay. Exiting the Gilded Age involved taking on monopolies, but by that time the idea of monopoly had evolved in ways that really parallel the present conversation. One of them was there are certain industries, and the ones they'd concentrate on would be railroads, which they called natural monopolies. They depend on economies of scale, they depend on efficiencies, they're capital intensive. You are not going to get better results by breaking those up. Those have to be regulated.
Yeah.
There are other industries, and this was a real objection to monopoly at the time, is that they exist by special privilege. That in fact it's government favoritism, whether it's through tariffs, whether it's through subsidies, whether it's going to be through corporate charters. All of these things give certain people an advantage and other people a disadvantage. Those you have to intervene on. Secondly, the real problem with monopoly, they had thought, was that it limits or distorts competition. That what monopoly means is that a company can pick and choose winners and losers, not just their success, but that everybody who has to use them. And that goes to the third concern about monopoly, which was it isn't business which everybody has to use. In the same way that Facebook or Google, you simply cannot avoid it, or at least without some kind of inconvenience. Those are the kinds of businesses which they would deem monopolies, which call for government regulation. By the time they start regulating, they go in two very different directions. Yeah, they break up some monopolies. They will break up some railroad monopolies, two big ones, but they don't break up the real big ones at all. But at the same time, others, U.S. Steel, DuPont, General Motors, are emerging at the same time. So with one hand, they break apart some corporations. With others, they allow them to come about. And the real irony of a lot of anti-monopoly legislation in its initial stages, going into the progressive era, is it was not used against corporations. It was used against labor. Most of the actions that are brought about from the Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, are things that are going to be aimed at labor unions, and you need new legislation to take care of those. So as monopoly evolves, one of the things they find in the progressive era is they're hitting at a moving target. Corporate organization is changing. The economy is changing. They have a set of solutions they passed 20 or 30 years before, which turn out to be fairly blunt instruments. And it's only going to be really in the New Deal that you begin to get a kind of stabilization of this, which will last up until pretty much my lifetime.
Right. Alex, how long will it take for the promise of digitalization to actually be realized, in your view? And, you know, understanding from what we heard recently, do you think that those tech titans are actually in pursuit of sharing innovation, having broad and generous philanthropic goals as well as the profit line? Or is it exclusively market domination, optimization of their operations?
Yes, so as to the question of when will sort of the promise of digitization reach everyday workers, I mean, this is, you know, you could have asked the question at the beginning of the industrial age, how long will it be till everyday workers benefit from industrialization? It's sort of a long process. This was a 100-year process. Progress will come incrementally and the benefits will accrue very unevenly. I would argue that, you know, when I grew up in West Virginia, a very poor part of Appalachia. And when I was growing up, the access to all of the world's knowledge was about a 2-mile walk away, that I would walk across a bridge and I would go into a very small public library. Growing up where I did in Appalachia, all of the knowledge available to me was in that little public library 2 miles away. I would argue that everyday workers today who have access to so much more knowledge because of things like Google are already benefiting enormously. The question of benefit versus economic benefit I would sort of segregate here. The question of when will everyday workers benefit economically, I think that is a longer and harder process than, say, they're benefiting from access to information and educational resources. To the question of these companies, sort of the big platform companies, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, are they continuing to innovate or are they just in the business of dominating markets? Well, I think those things are not mutually exclusive, but I think that their first order of business is to maximize shareholder value. These are not charitable organizations. They may have started with idealistic roots, but today they are in the business of returning money to shareholders and building wealth. And while a lot of these Silicon Valley companies have logos or a sense of spirit that is essentially public spirited, at the end of the day, they're there to make money. Are they innovating? Sure, lots of them are innovating spectacularly. and they're doing so internally. We got the drive from Baltimore, we used Google Maps. Gmail, free email for everybody. You know, if you look at the commodification of music that Apple did, it's remarkable. But here's the problem with the size of these large platform companies. Yes, they innovate, but the thing that's troublesome to me is that when innovation takes place outside of one of those platform companies, one of two things happen. Either they buy the company, and if the company won't sell, then what they will do is they will build their own version of the product, they will preference it on their platform, and they will then kill the innovation that is taking place at the edge. So are they innovative? Yes, there are lots of very, very, very smart people that work at these platform companies. But the problem is how they relate to innovation taking place from outside of their organization and outside of their ecosystem. So right now, if you're a venture capitalist, it used to be the case that when you were a venture capitalist, you would think principally about going public, about things like this. Today, venture capitalists invest thinking ahead of time about which big platform company is going to invest the startup that they're building.
That's assuming they don't take into account certain antitrust authorities which eventually inspect exactly what access is offered to so-and-so by such and such platform, and if not all access is permitted, then sanctions can eventually apply. It's certainly the case in the European Union.
And let me add just one point to this question about regulation. You know, it was interesting hearing your feedback about whether these companies need to be more aggressively regulated, lightly regulated, not regulated at all. The problem is that when you take this away from being a hypothetical based on a theoretical based on a maybe, there are actually human beings that do this regulation. And if you look at, Mark Zuckerberg, if you looked at his testimony before the United States Senate, I might say, yes, reasonable oversight and antitrust is good, but I don't want it being done by the people who are asking those questions. But this is the reality of this. Like,
not everywhere in the world.
Not everywhere in the world. So I'm speaking just about the United States in this respect. This is one of those moments in time. There are 196 countries on planet Earth. I have a lot more confidence in the 195 that are not the United States right now.
All right, let's not go there. Bridget, you've told us in the past about Watson and about the extraordinary development of blockchain. Do you... I was going to quote several, not competitors, but colleagues, whether it's University of Oxford, whether it's McKinsey, whether it's OECD, they're all coming out with numbers. X% of the future jobs will be actually completely automated, robotized, and substituted by AI. The percentages vary. The number of and type of jobs that will be affected vary as well. What's your take on that? Because you see it, and that's your day-to-day dialogue with companies.
Yeah, so certainly there will be a massive, massive shift in the tasks, Christine, that constitute occupations. So we actually think that artificial intelligence and blockchain and these robotics technologies will change the bulk of the tasks we do. But when you look throughout history, and technology innovations of the last 50 years or so, really 95% of occupations have prevailed. 5% have changed, and those will become new engineering and science jobs. But it's the tasks within the 95% of occupations that change significantly. And so if you start to think about that, I would say two things will happen that give me cause for optimism. And we're seeing these happening today. So the first thing is, despite the rise of large technology platforms, in fact, many, many companies, large and small, are experimenting with technologies like artificial intelligence and blockchain, and they are putting them to work in daily tasks for business models and jobs. So
it's affecting all jobs and all processes.
So, for instance, doctors using artificial intelligence and Watson to understand oncology statistics, all the academic research, and be able to assimilate that and put that into treatment protocols. Or in the regulatory and compliance field, feeding Watson all the regulatory changes for a jurisdiction, and Watson being able to help the professional to actually assemble a dossier or use case for a know your customer or anti-money laundering case, and actually help so that the person can spend their time on the higher value activities.
Bridget, I can't resist asking you to tell us the story of Watson Oncology India.
So that's a very interesting story. In oncology in India, Manipal Hospitals uses Watson to assist doctors with oncology diagnosis. In India, I think in total there are a couple of hundred trained oncologists, and that's it. And yet, obviously, you know the population. And so the size, in this hospital network, not in India overall. And so the size of the population that they cover ends up being one oncologist for a couple of 100,000 people. So what we have done is trained Watson with the help of Sloan Kettering in New York City along clinical data, research, doctors' treatment protocols, and Watson is able to work to assist the doctor to identify relevant research, relevant protocols, analogous data on the patient, and recommend with a level of confidence and a basis of reasoning various treatment protocols and tell the doctor why. And this, of course, means that the doctors can actually work with a greater level of precision, expertise, and impact on individuals' lives. And the early work we've done so far says that this approach is very, very successful for the patients and the doctors. So when you look at this, and then you look at things like blockchain, where you can instantly see and share data in a complex supply chain like global trade, where 15% of the data, the spend of global trade today is on bilateral document flows on a blockchain that can be done simultaneously and simply eliminated. Or food safety, where we all know the romaine lettuce thing being here in DC, huge romaine lettuce call around the eastern seaboard of the US. If you've got romaine lettuce in your fridge, throw it out is the message. We've worked with Walmart, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Golden State Foods, Dole, Kroger, all the big players in the industry to put food safety on a blockchain so that they can recall with precision in 2 seconds. Today, the best in class for food recall is Walmart. It takes them 6 days, 18 hours, and 23 minutes to identify with precision where a certain item came from that is bad or rotten. The consequence of this, of taking it from that time to 2 seconds and doing it in an ecosystem that everybody sees it and digitally, is huge for the world. 30% of our food is wasted. 400,000 people die every year from food poisoning around the world. So when I think about these technologies that I see now, not being a futurist, but being a technologist, I do see a tremendous power both for good, but also for better and more interesting jobs and work. And if I could just finish on that point, I think that is where the work will be required. There are new and very different skills required to do work in the digital age, to work with artificial intelligence and blockchain and these capabilities. One is a real focus on technology training, but also human skills such as creativity, design, collaboration will be essential in this period. So I think governments in collaboration, such as a thing that IBM is donating into called P-Tech, where we have brought a high school curriculum into an associate degree and embedded it within technology. There are now 150 such schools around the world with a pipeline of 70,000 students. That kind of merging high school associate degrees and science curricula, I think, will be essential with public-private partnership for both training at school level, but also transitions throughout people's careers is going to be needed. And then secondly, I think the principles and the values that we use to think about artificial intelligence will need to be embraced by everyone. So things like, we believe we have a philosophy and a set of principles that we are strongly behind, which says artificial intelligence should be used for man-machine collaboration and should be used to support the human condition. That should be the purpose, that the world brings artificial intelligence into use. The second really important thing is transparency, and this goes to the tech platforms and the exploitation of all of our data. The artificial intelligence should be transparent, where the data comes from, the models that are being used, and what is the training that artificial intelligence is using. Just to give you a sense of this, only 80% of the world's data is searchable. The rest is all privately held. So there's a long way to go on artificial intelligence. And then finally, this investment in skills for all of us so that we can seize it is essential.
Great segue into what I wanted to ask Talman, actually. What policies, you talked about education, you talked about leverage, you talked about scale and impact. What policies can we actually recommend or put in place to optimize the benefits, to minimize the disruption, and all that without creating additional inequality? And maybe you can talk about the life cycle training that you've been considering as in your capacity as minister.
Right. So I think what Bridget was saying is exciting. It's happening, but it isn't happening across a large span of society. And our first task has to be to spread that. That's our first task. We need more disruption, not less. More disruption in every sector of the economy. Then we have the issue of what happens to the people. Because disruption typically means you might lose your job, or if you're lucky, you keep the job, but it changes quite fundamentally. And I think we spend far too much time in the argument as to whether it's going to be 5%, as Bridget says, who get displaced, or is it 49%, or is it something in between? I think the weight of evidence suggests that there will be jobs available, but they may not be very good jobs. And in fact, what's been happening in the last 10 to 15 years, across the developed world especially, certainly in the United States, is that people have lost jobs which were reasonably well-paying and at reasonably high productivity, and they've moved into less well-paying and lower skill and lower productivity jobs, which, by the way, is the first time it's happened in history, because history has always been about moving from agriculture into modern industry in towns, moving into modern services, and each time you move, you're moving from a lower productivity sector to a higher productivity sector. That's what economic growth was about. Now we are seeing almost a reverse of that happening. And I don't think it's happening because of technology. It's happening because of our political and educational priorities. That's what we have to fix. It's not technology. How do we do it? I think if you look around the world, we are struck that in the most advanced world, Germany seems to have lost fewer jobs than the United States. And when people move jobs, fewer of them have moved into lousy jobs. Why is that the case? What is the difference? And I think when you just dig a little bit into it, it's first a different education system with a much stronger emphasis on applied skills post age 15, but it's also about the responsibility of companies. Companies take very seriously, whether it's the large companies or the Mittelstand, they take very seriously continuous investment in their people. And we all are learning.
And there is a contract between the unions and the business.
And there's a contract. And the Danish take it further because for the Danish, it's a nationwide tripartite arrangement that obliges, in fact, starting from this year, obliges all companies to engage in lifelong training of their employees. It's a different field compared to traditional education. Primary schools, secondary schools, and you go to university or you go to some sort of college. That's still a field that's extremely important. And particularly in the developing world, that's still a critical priority. But in a good part of the advanced world, and I would say for all of us, investing in people at regular intervals through their lives, not necessarily in a traditional classroom, typically in ways that are related to a job they have. We need the mechanisms, we need the funding, we need a way of making it appealing to people. And there's something about learning in a way that's related to what you're doing that for many of us kicks us into the right gear. Many people don't do very well in school because it's abstract, it's sort of, you're not quite sure why you're learning this. It's, some people do it very well, but most people don't. But learning in a way that's relevant to what you're doing. I mean, if you're studying football techniques, for instance. You'd never study football techniques without playing a game, without trying it out, It's so natural to do it that way. So likewise, whether it's the latest mechanization that you need to learn, whether it's the latest fintech that you need to hop onto, it's learned much better if it's close to a job. And what we've got to do to help people is to train them in ways that don't just lock them into one employer. And it's not about either you go to university or you go and do something applied in a firm. There's a lot of space in between. There's a lot of space in between to develop occupation-specific skills, industry-specific skills, and that help you to move on. Once one skill becomes obsolete, it helps you to move on to an adjacent skill, something just beside it, which takes advantage of what you learned before. Legacy skills are never useless. Legacy skills are always useful. They lead on to something else. They lead on to an adjacent skill. So that's the whole habit of public policy we have to develop. Investing in people through their lives, getting employers to play their part. First, because it's a social responsibility, but second, because it's a sustainable business strategy. And there are countries that show that it can be done.
Brigitte was talking about public-private partnership in that respect. Do you think that that's one of the keys?
It is absolutely the key, and going back to what Alex was saying, his story about West Virginia, it's very interesting when you look around the world at where it's done well. In Stuttgart, Tübingen corridor, in parts of France where you have vibrant industries, even Italy, which by the way has some problems, even Italy has the Emilia-Romagna region, vibrant.
True.
But the interesting thing about all these stories, and in the US, in the Rust Belt, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, vibrant, it's always a town or a city, at most a region with a few cities, but it's typically local. And that's a very interesting lesson. It's interesting because it's at the local level that social partnerships and obligations are formed. He went to school with me. I know her mother. It's the social obligations that count. That's why we keep investing in each other. That's why we keep learning from each other. And people feel better.
So that's the thank you for being late.
That's the thank you for being late.
That's the thank you for being late.
So
the key is the community.
So concentrate, and the task of federal policy and national policy should also be to help local communities invest in themselves and develop those partnerships between schools, colleges, employers, and the R&D institutions. There are useful lessons already in various parts of the world. Some countries do it more systematically. We are trying our best in Singapore to do it well. But the lessons are flowing in all directions. It's fascinating. Shenzhen in China is an amazing hub of innovation. So we're now learning from each other in every direction. But remember, local partnerships matter. It's social and not just economic, not just business. It's also social. And it can be done. It's not about technology. It's about our political priorities and the way we invest in people.
Yes. Yeah, we're all passionate, so thank you. Second question that we put to Twitter was, who should provide the solutions to the threats posed by tech firms, particularly with respect to ensuring inclusive growth and shared prosperity? So here are the results. 24% government, 13% users, 8% tech firms, 55% all of the above. And that's to your point. Partnership, bringing people together, using all the input from all. I'm going to stay with you, Talman, if I may, for a second. What do you think, how can we ensure, with the disruption that you've advocated, how can we ensure, despite the disruption, economic and social stability? And what policies can we put in place to actually encourage innovation, while at the same time protecting those that are at risk of being left to the side of the road?
So I think going back to your very first question at the start about regulation and markets, and I said we need more regulation, and I was interpreting regulation in a very broad sense. What I mean is we need more public policy intervention and more cooperative solutions. A very interesting feature of the societies that are doing better at spreading innovation is the role of market intermediaries. Not just the fact of a market, but there's an intermediary player. If you look at Germany, for instance, you've got the Fraunhofer Society. What do you say in German? Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, I think. You've got something called the Steinbeis Foundation. Now, these are associations that connect the latest R&D, the latest developments in universities, to the SMEs. The market doesn't do it very well. The market doesn't do it very well. But these are intermediaries, often with a commercial objective, that try their best to connect innovation in the places where it starts with the rest of industry. And they do it quite well. That's what we're trying to do in Singapore as well, through what we call industry transformation maps. Second...
And those maps are activated by public?
Well, it's a public-private partnership.
Okay.
The government initiated it, but it only works with the business federations and associations and the unions getting involved.
Exactly.
The second issue is about individuals and workers, which I spoke about earlier. I think we are just nowhere near exploiting the potential for people to keep learning through life. We're nowhere near exploiting it. So first, fix the problems in school systems, which are problems in many countries of the world. France, by the way, a key part of Macron's education revolution is fixing the schools and helping the kids who are disadvantaged to actually leave school with something they can be confident about.
Age 3.
Absolutely.
Starting point.
Absolutely. And it's a real act of leadership to recognize that in an advanced society, there are problems of a basic nature. But post-school is where a big game is going to be about. And we've got to develop ways in which employers, colleges, private training providers, and intermediaries, like what I was talking about, intermediaries that are trying to match them and will have a business model that works because they match people. That's what we've got to get going. And it creates over time a bit of a positive spiral that's intangible. Once you have it, that positive spiral becomes an asset in itself. Because once the leading employers start doing it, others want to get in the game. You train your employees, they may leave you, but the people you're hiring have been well trained by someone else. And it just becomes a habit and a culture. So we can do it. We've seen places which are doing it well, and we all want to scale it up.
Perfect. Back to you, Richard. You have argued that the real debate is not about the type of regulation, but the effects that monopolies have. And, as a result of that, what actions can we take?
Well, I think from the 19th and 20th century, it's not just the type of regulation, it's what the end of regulation is. Yeah. If the end of regulation is simply to produce goods at the lowest cost, then regulation in many ways has worked, but you get all of these side effects. But that was never the original intent of regulation. The original intent of regulation was that the companies were supposed to exist in an environment which would produce, in terms of the United States, citizens, Republican citizens of general economic equality, a certain wide span. And that they were going to have certain sets of opportunities. And that at the price of that was going to be they lost control over their lives, which is what they thought. That if regulation meant, in fact, in terms of efficiency, workers have very little to say how work is done. In your terms, they never learn anything. They are told what to do. Then, in fact, regulation is not working. And as they give up the idea that the major goal of regulation is going to be, in terms of production, small-scale producers, then you get a concept like the living wage in the United States. And that the point of regulation is that everybody, no matter where they work, is going to get a living wage. Those things get lost sight of. The consumer is citizen, the consumer producer vanishes, and all you have is the consumer is consumer. And when you have the consumer's consumer and your goal is regulation, then you will be able to drive down costs, but you will also increasingly get people who are very discontented in every other phase of their life.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Alec, it hasn't escaped anybody that the difference between the Gilded Age and what we're seeing today, despite all the similarities that Richard has identified, in those days we were talking about railroads. There was a beginning, there was an end, and there was a territorial aspect to it. The titans of today are not limited by boundaries. They're not limited by territories. It's open space. What difference does it make in terms of spreading the innovation, sharing or not sharing, regulating, and if so, how, measuring the impact and addressing them?
Yeah, so the world that Richard has written about was much more, as you said, much more bounded geographically. There were physical rail tracks with rail cars that went over it. There was no question of jurisdiction. Facebook has 1.3 billion monthly users spread around the earth. Google has more. And so the degree to which these kinds of firms brush up against the very concept of the structures and strictures of the Westphalian nation state, these are sort of new challenges for us. They're entirely new challenges. And what I think that what this calls for is it calls for, to the extent that there's going to be regulation or even discussion around what obligations are for the kind of social contract that's been discussed here, it does require multilateralism. It requires multilateralism. And we're at a moment, as you know right now, diplomatically, where multilateralism is very difficult. But it's not just transatlantic, it increasingly has to be trans-Pacific. We have to coalesce around a set of core values and principles if we are going to be able to engage with these firms in a productive way. Land was the raw material of the agricultural age. Iron was the raw material of the industrial age. Data is the raw material of the information age. He who owned the land and controlled the land during the agricultural age had the economic power and the political power. He who owned the factories or controlled access to the natural resources during the industrial age had the economic power and the political power. He or she who own the data, control the data, or can harvest meaning from the data are those that are creating the industries and businesses of the future. The distinctive aspect of this this period is that it is inherently transnational. And so what I believe this calls for is multilateralism. That's difficult, but on a more optimistic note, what I would say is I still don't know that I would concede that most of these firms are monopolies, or I would at least want to debate it. I remember a magazine cover that said, "The final battle for the internet, Microsoft versus AOL." And a lot of these are still very young companies. They have built up enormously powerful cash machines, and they have data that puts them in an extremely powerful position. But maybe I'm the overly optimistic American. I do imagine that there's some 17-year-old in Mumbai, there's some 14-year-old girl in Singapore, there's some 16-year-old in Warsaw right now who's figuring out ways of doing something better. And honestly, if I were a venture capitalist with a few $100 million right now, I would go right after Facebook. I would do something that does not involve any data retention whatsoever. It's on a monthly paid model. And maybe it doesn't grow to have a $500 billion market cap, but I bet it might be able to produce tens of billions of dollars of market cap. So I actually see these platforms as very powerful. They are beautiful businesses in a certain respect. But if I were an insurgent, if I were a venture capitalist, I would actually think about ways of targeting them and in imagining and inventing something better or something different that people might opt into where they are wary of engaging with the incumbents.
In the hope that they don't gobble you.
But I think this competition is not necessarily a bad thing. I remember, again, AOL versus Microsoft. And then there are a couple graduate students at Stanford University who come along and whap.
True.
I guess I'm optimistic about the teenage. I'm 46 now, so I'm past all this. But I'm optimistic about the teenagers around the world who are not bounded by the sense of impossibility or impenetrability or monopoly, who can build something cool and build something different and build something that hundreds of millions or billions of people would want to use instead of these other products.
You know, I think there will be one area where some discussions will be had, and that's in respect of taxation.
Yes.
Because as governments around the world are short of revenue and desperate to get more, clearly the fact that there are no boundaries, that the principle of permanent establishment is no longer going to be applicable to some of those players, is going to bring them around a table where they're going to have to discuss the new rules of engagement and the way in which taxation is going to be devised. And that has to be of a multilateral dimension, It
has to, and this is one of the, you know, I frequently, you know, when I find myself, and this is not the case here, but, you know, I frequently will be in environments where people are sort of just bashing the platform companies, and I will feel like, all right, well, let's bring a little different perspective. On this issue of tax, it's indefensible. On this issue of tax, and, you know, oh, well, the server is located on this obscure island, therefore all the sales are flowing through this obscure, this tax haven. That's indefensible. And I do think that multilateralism, to the extent that we do have to find a place where we can collaborate transatlantically and transpacifically, something to start on, I think starting on tax is a very good place to start.
Yeah. Bridget, how far do you think artificial intelligence and blockchain are going to take us?
Well, I'm with the minister. I think very far, and I think it is really early days. And I think that when you look around the world, the amount of experimentation and integration of artificial intelligence into real physical businesses today, through the Internet of Things, through blockchains, we are starting to see it take root in many, many businesses. So part of my optimism for this new technology is I believe it will become a capability like using the internet or search that every employee in every organization actually applies into their work. So April the 17th, a few days ago, was tax day here in the United States. H&R Block, which is the country's tax advisor on the subject of tax, all its tax advisors now use artificial intelligence to assist them in providing deeper advice. So I look at the world and I say, every physical domain we're in, from provenance of food, diamonds. Everledger is putting diamonds on a blockchain to make sure that you don't buy a black diamond. Provenance will change, and we will be in a world where we have better provenance for everything we eat and drink and buy. We'll be in a world where supply chains act simultaneously and much quicker. We will be in a world, one of the most promising areas for artificial intelligence and blockchain is our own personal identity. There is technology on a blockchain today that would allow you to permission your own identity, to permission your data to others, so nobody could take it and exploit it. So I look at worlds where we could, from a finance point of view, speed up finance. There are blockchains that are occurring today. We have one in Southeast Asia that speeds up payments, makes them instantaneously on low-traded currency corridors. 6 banks in Europe are working with us on a blockchain which actually takes small and medium business financing for export. They've shared the blockchain as a consortium, and they can issue it in 2 days versus today's 45 days. The significance of that is huge because 40% of small and medium businesses in Europe don't get the export financing they need. So the idea of taking friction out of the economy with these technologies that can optimize, like credit models or diagnoses or regulation and compliance mapping, together with blockchain that can make things faster, trusted, and accountable by a consensus model for those in the network. The technology exists today. It's being used by many, many, many companies, not just the big 4 platform companies, and all of them are incorporating these digital capabilities together with their physical footprint. And I agree it has a long way to go, but I think the early days are promising. The point about regulation for me is key. If you think about regulation saying, I want to speed up and accelerate my technology capability and make myself more competent to seize this opportunity, there is a lot regulation can do to both help, but also to make safe. right? Because one of the issues with blockchain, for instance, is when you start to talk about payments, you certainly need all the AML, KYC, as you wrote in your recent payment. Yeah. So regulation and governments will be key partners in this world. But I do actually see a world which doesn't result in dominance by a few, but actually can extend these capabilities to many more. And what I see with many clients around the world is once you start working with them, you can use them and integrate them quickly in your business model. They are not the domain of nuclear physicists in Silicon Valley. The world can use this.
Right. And as Tarun was saying, it's not just the Silicon Valley either. There are tech titans in various corners of the world as well. Now, I'm going to put a question to you, and while you think about it, I'll take, just like on television, cables, and other places, I'll take 30 seconds to do a little bit of advertising for the IMF. Mm-hmm. So, the question for you to think about is, what, and you're only entitled to one thing, what immediate change could make the current landscape more equitable, more competitive, more inclusive, more innovative? One change. I'll come back to you in a second. Now is advertising. So, I was very surprised to read in one of the excellent newspaper overnight that the IMF doesn't pay enough attention to digital transformation. So, for that person and many others, I would simply like to say that we have recently published a paper that was commissioned by the G20, which is called The Future of Work. And this paper actually, very interesting, highlights what policies are needed in the field of education, in the field of training, to help ensure that productivity and income gains are shared evenly. Highly recommended reading. We do care about what impact digital development and technologies will have on the workplace, but not just on the workplace. We also have an interesting publication. If you paid attention to the launch of the Fiscal Monitor this morning, you will have noted that there is a special chapter that underscores the importance of political resolve to adopt digital while mitigating risks such as cybersecurity and privacy issues. Governments also need to take ownership of these digital developments, and some of them actually do to their benefit, with less leakages, less tax evasion, and much better revenue. Finally, and that's self-serving, I don't like to do that, but I was really highly recommended. I recently wrote a blog that is called Fight Fire with Fire, in which actually the risks that are associated with the use of cryptocurrencies, for instance, in relation to anti-money laundering, or rather in relation with money laundering, in relation with the financing of terrorism, can actually be turned on its head by using the same technologies to actually try to eradicate the malfeasance resulting from those uses. So yes, we do pay attention. Now, turning to the question, if you had one change, what would that be?
So I think since you asked the question in a global context, I'll have to say that one change should try to solve our biggest global challenge, which is actually a challenge in the developing world. I think we must get basic education right in Africa, in Latin America, and in South Asia.
Yes.
The IMF has written about it. The World Bank just came up with another blog 2 days ago. It's criminal what's happening. And we've got to get systems in place so that first, people do their jobs in education. It's not very expensive. It just requires a system. It requires political attention and accountability. And if we don't get that right, the world has something coming.
Yeah. You know, from discussions that we've had with quite a few finance ministers also interested in education, as you are, what we hear from them is that it's everything that you said, but it also requires some fiscal space, which they have to actually attribute to education, so that teachers, trainers see value in the work that they do. And there are multiple ways to value contributions, but one of them is also use of fiscal space for education purposes, and not in minimal proportions. Bridget, one change.
I'm building on yours. It's really about access to and curriculum content for the later high school years and early tertiary education, which I think should be more applied and more technologically oriented, and far more people in the world need access to it, because that level of education, i.e. an increased level of education from basic schooling, will be required for the jobs of tomorrow.
Thank you. Alec?
I'm sitting up here because even though I grew up a mile from a coal mine in the hills of West Virginia, one of the poorest parts of the United States, there were good schools that I went to. And that is what enabled my upward mobility. And when I think about this in a global context, I can't help but think that that which will most increase equity is access to really good education in historically disadvantaged communities. I'm a beneficiary of it. I think talent is everywhere. Talent is universally distributed. Opportunity is not.
Thank you, Alec. Richard?
I'm the only educator, and education would not be my first solution. What I would say is that people can certainly benefit from education, but if people don't believe they have a control over their lives, their sort of civic lives and their working lives, there's going to be very little incentive to have education. So unless you can get that basic kind of reform, that when people go to work, when people participate in civic activities, they have some sense of control, education is not something I think that's going to solve all the other problems. So while I am heartily anti-education, that is not the first place I'd turn.
Control over one's life. Control your destiny and then seek the right education.
Not just your individual destiny, but a sense of community engagement in which the community is some kind
community.
of control.
Yes. Okay. Now, oh dear, the clock says 0, 0, 0. So I can't turn over to you, audience. Apologies from this panel here, but big round of applause to all our panelists. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
That was great.